Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. It is good to have you back around our storytelling fire today, as we continue the journey we began together in the high frozen mountains of the New Mexico territory. If you were with us for part 1 of the Embers of Mogollon, you will remember the desperate, harrowing night that unfolded on the winter slopes of the Black Range in December 1875. You will remember 24-year-old Elena Vance, abandoned 8 months pregnant by her husband Caleb, left with nothing more than a cruel 4-line note by the salt jar and a dying hearth in a freezing cabin. And you will remember Silas, known to his people as Tahza of the Eagle Eye Apache, who heard her cries through the howling teeth of a blizzard and made the fateful decision not to walk away. Through hours of grueling, agonizing labor, Silas knelt in the firelight, offering his steady hands, his calm voice, and his unbroken strength to help Elena bring her daughter, little Clara, into the world just as the dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo peaks. But as the morning light flooded the snowbound cabin, a new and terrifying trial emerged. Elena was hemorrhaging, the winter provisions were gone, and waist-deep snowdrifts had trapped them 8,000 feet above the valley. Knowing that Miraculous and child would not survive 2 days without medicine and nourishment, Silas made a sacrifice that few men in the frontier west would have dared to conceive. He laid his only rifle beside Elena to protect her, turned his back on the safety of the high mountains, and set out on foot into the blinding white snow, walking completely unarmed into the hostile frontier settlement of San Rafael, knowing full well that in the winter of 1875, an Apache man was often shot on sight before he could ever speak a single word of truth. Now, the morning sun climbs higher into a pale, crystalline sky, and the silence of the mountain gives way to the dangerous, suspicious streets of the valley below. The 7 miles between Elena's high country homestead and the settlement of San Rafael were 7 miles of unbroken, exhausting torment. The December blizzard had carved the mountain passes into an alien landscape of sculpted drifts and treacherous ice shelves. In the steep draws, the wind-packed powder came up to Silas's hips, requiring him to plow his body through the crust with the slow, grinding endurance of an ox. His breath billowed in thick, white plumes, freezing into tiny icicles in his eyebrows and along the straight black hair that fell across his shoulders. His fleece-lined coat was dusted white with frost, and his thigh muscles burned with a dull, throbbing ache that deepened with every stride. Yet, as his rawhide moccasins crunched through the snow, Silas's mind remained as still and focused as a mountain pool beneath winter ice. He was an Apache warrior, trained from boyhood to master his own fear, to quiet the frantic beating of his heart, and to look upon danger not as an enemy, but as a terrain to be negotiated with discipline and precision. He thought of the sacred balance of Goju, the ancient understanding that when the Creator places a life in your hands, your own comfort and safety cease to have any meaning. He carried with him the image of Elena lying by the warm stones of the fireplace, the pale exhaustion etched into her young face, and the tiny, miraculous weight of baby Clara bundled in his coat. He knew that with every minute that slipped away, Elena's blood was weeping slowly onto the flannels beneath her, and the fire he had built was burning through its seasoned oak. If he failed today, if his courage faltered or his temper flared, that fire would die, and 2 souls who had touched the deepest part of his spirit would freeze in the dark. By 7:30 in the morning, the dense ponderosa pines of the foothills began to thin, giving way to the open, snowy flats of the valley floor. Ahead, nestled along the frozen banks of the creek bed, the frontier town of San Rafael began to take shape beneath a low canopy of gray wood smoke. San Rafael was not a large town, but in 1875, it was a hard, suspicious place. Built around a freight depot, a livery syndicate, and a handful of saloons catering to prospectors and cattlemen, it was a settlement populated by people who lived on the raw edge of survival. They were folks who had buried their kin in shallow graves along the emigrant trails, folks who slept with loaded shotguns beside their beds, and folks whose minds had been fed for years on lurid newspaper accounts of border skirmishes and Indian raids. To them, the high mountains were a dark, threatening wall, and the Apache people who called those peaks home were ghosts to be feared and hunted. Silas stopped at the edge of the cottonwood grove that marked the western boundary of the town. He stood in the snow, closed his eyes for 3 long seconds, and drew the freezing valley air deep into his lungs. He reached down to his waist. He had no carbine on his shoulder. He had no hunting knife at his hip. His hands were completely empty. He adjusted the collar of his coat, squared his broad shoulders, lifted his chin, and stepped out of the tree line onto the snow-packed wagon road that formed the main street of San Rafael. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The town was just beginning to stir with the cold commerce of a weekday. Along the wooden boardwalks, shopkeepers were scraping the night's frost from their glass display windows with tin spatulas. Outside the livery stable, a teamster was harnessing a team of 6 heavy mules to a freight wagon, his breath rising in clouds of steam as he cursed the stiff leather traces. From the chimney of the bakery, the scent of fresh sourdough bread drifted into the street, mingling with the sharp, acidic smell of coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge. And then, with the sudden, shocking finality of a glass falling on stone, the rhythm of the town died. It began with the blacksmith. The heavy, rhythmic clink-clank of his hammer against the iron anvil stopped mid-swing. The smith, a burly man with soot-stained leather sleeves, froze in the open doorway of his shop, his eyes locking onto the tall, solitary figure walking down the center of the road. 10 yards away, the teamster dropped the leather harness into the snow. The mules sensed the sudden tension in the air, tossing their heavy heads and snorting nervously. Silas did not slow his pace, nor did he hurry. He walked directly down the middle of the street, where the snow had been packed down by wagon wheels, keeping to the exact center line of the road, so that he offered no surprise and sought no cover. His posture was magnificent in its calm authority. His back was as straight as an arrow, his head held high, his dark eyes looking neither to the left nor to the right, but fixed unswervingly on the 2-story pine building, with the weathered porch 300 yards ahead, the office of the town sheriff. He held his arms slightly away from his body, his large, scarred hands held at waist level with his palms turned outward and visible, showing every man with a rifle that he carried no steel, no lead, and no intent to strike. Yet the sheer audacity of his arrival struck the settlement like an electric shock. To the people of San Rafael, an Apache man did not walk down the main street in broad daylight. An Apache was something that moved like smoke in the high timber, something spoken of in hushed, frightened tones around tavern tables. To see a lone warrior, broad-shouldered and commanding, walking through the center of their town with the relaxed, measured stride of a man walking through his own living room, completely paralyzed their ability to understand what was happening. For 100 yards, the only sound in the entire valley was the steady, rhythmic crunch of Silas's moccasins against the frozen snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then, the panic began to spread. Across the street, the frosted front door of the Longhorn Saloon swung open with a violent creak. 3 men who had spent the night over whiskey and card tables stumbled onto the wooden porch, their eyes bloodshot, their hands instinctively dropping to the holsters tied down against their thighs. On the second floor of the boarding house, lace curtains were yanked aside, revealing the pale, frightened faces of women who quickly pulled their children back into the shadows of the bedrooms. Behind the shuttered windows of the dry goods store, the sharp, metallic clack-clack of a Winchester lever-action rifle being racked echoed through the morning air with unmistakable clarity. Men stepped out from alleyways and stable doors, their postures rigid with hostile disbelief. They did not speak, they only watched, their eyes tracking the tall stranger with the particular, dangerous quality of an armed crowd that had not yet found its voice, but was rapidly finding its fear. Silas felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes upon him. He felt the cold prickle of the rifle barrels trained on the center of his chest from behind half-closed doors. He knew that a single sudden movement, a stumble in the snow, or a hand reaching toward his coat pocket would bring a volley of lead that would tear him to pieces before he could take another breath. He did not flinch. He did not look at the guns. He kept his eyes locked on the sheriff's porch, matching his footsteps to the slow, steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, whispering Elena's name inside his spirit like a shield. 50 yards from the sheriff's office, the silence was finally shattered. The heavy door of Ramsey's Mercantile slammed back against the exterior wall with a thunderous crash, and Harlan Ramsey strode out onto the boardwalk. Ramsey was 45 years old, a thick, broad-chested man with a florid, red face, mutton-chop sideburns, and the aggressive, self-important swagger of someone who owned half the mortgages in the county and believed that wealth gave him the right to dictate the laws of the territory. In his thick, gloved hands, he carried a 10-gauge, double-barreled shotgun, both hammers pulled back to full cock. "Hold it right there," Ramsey roared, his voice booming across the street, thick with outrage and terrified bravado. "Stop where you stand, or, by God, I'll blow you in two." Behind Ramsey, 4 of his freight hands and warehouse loaders poured out onto the porch, armed with revolvers and axe handles. The crowd that had been lingering in the alleys and doorways began to close in from behind, forming a tense, nervous semicircle 30 paces behind Silas, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Silas stopped. He was standing in the very center of the town square, 20 feet from the porch of the sheriff's office. The morning sun was directly at his back, casting his long, dark shadow across the snow toward the boardwalk. He did not drop his hands. He kept them open, palms out, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate calm. He looked at Harlan Ramsey. He saw the sweat glistening on the man's red forehead despite the sub-zero chill. He saw the slight, nervous twitch in Ramsey's right forefinger as it rested against the front trigger of the shotgun. He recognized the smell that was rolling off the merchant, the sour, dangerous smell of a coward who held a loaded weapon and was looking for an excuse to pull it so he wouldn't have to admit how frightened he truly was. "You've got a lot of nerve walking into this town, Apache," Ramsey spat, taking 2 heavy steps down the boardwalk, steps into the snow, his shotgun leveled directly at the center of Silas's chest. "Who's with you? Where's your raiding party? You think you can march down from the reservation and scout our freight lines in broad daylight?" Silas did not answer. He did not look at the shotgun barrel staring at his heart. He kept his gaze fixed on the heavy pine door behind Ramsey. Ramsey's face flushed a deeper, furious crimson at the silence. He turned his head toward the gathering crowd, his voice rising in an hysterical attempt to whip the townsfolk into a frenzy. "You see that? He's mocking us. They've come down from the Mogollon to hit the stage line before the spring thaw. We don't need a trial for a redskin scout. We've got a rope in the livery, and we've got a cottonwood tree by the creek. I say we string him up right now before his war party hits the valley." A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the crowd behind Silas. Men shifted their boots in the snow, hands tightened around wooden handles and iron triggers. The mob was balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the first spark to turn their collective fear into murder. Ramsey took another step forward, his finger tightening on the shotgun trigger, his teeth bared in a snarl. "I'm giving you 3 seconds to speak, boy, or I'll scatter your insides across this snow." Silas did not blink. He stood like an ancient cedar rooted in mountain granite, completely unmoved by the screaming man before him. And then, before Ramsey's finger could complete its pull, the door of the sheriff's office swung open with a quiet, measured creak. "Put that scattergun down, Harlan." The voice was not loud, but it possessed the cold, dense authority of iron striking an anvil. It cut through the hysteria in the street with such absolute finality that every man in the square instantly fell silent. Sheriff Samuel Foster stepped out onto the porch. He was 52 years old, a tall, spare man with broad, weathered shoulders that carried the slight, permanent stoop of an old cavalry officer. His beard was steel gray, neatly trimmed, and his pale blue eyes sat deep beneath heavy, craggy brows, eyes that had looked upon the bloody peach orchards of Shiloh and the tangled horrors of the wilderness, eyes that had seen every conceivable variety of human violence and had long since lost the capacity to be impressed by loud men with guns. Foster wore a heavy, unadorned wool frock coat, unbuttoned at the front to reveal a worn leather vest and a simple 5-pointed silver star pinned over his left breast. His right hand rested casually on the wooden railing of the porch, inches from the walnut grip of the Colt Army revolver holstered at his hip, but he made no move to draw it. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the rifles poking out from the tavern windows. His pale blue eyes locked onto Silas. Foster took in the entire scene in a single, comprehensive glance that lasted no more than 3 seconds. He saw the knee-high moccasins coated in frozen mountain snow. He saw the frost clinging to the fringe of the fleece coat. He saw the absence of weapons, and above all, he saw the profound, unshakable dignity in the tall Apache man's posture. A man who had come to raid did not walk down the center of Main Street at 8 in the morning with empty hands. A man who had come to kill did not stand calmly in the snow with frostbitten fingers. Foster turned his head slightly, his gaze dropping to Harlan Ramsey with a look of cold, weary contempt. "I said lower the gun, Harlan," Foster repeated, his voice dropping an octave into dangerous territory. "You pull both triggers on that 10 gauge at 20 feet, and half that buckshot is going to pepper the front of my office. Now point it at the dirt before I take it away from you and wrap it around your neck." Ramsey's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment, his face alternating between fury and humiliation. He looked at the hard, unyielding set of Foster's jaw, realized that the sheriff was entirely prepared to shoot him where he stood, and slowly, reluctantly, lowered the barrels of the shotgun toward the snow, though he kept both hammers cocked. "He's an Apache, Foster," Ramsey hissed through his teeth, trying desperately to salvage his authority in front of the crowd. "He has no business in San Rafael. The law says, the law in this county is what I say. It is between sunrise and sunset," Foster interrupted smoothly, never taking his eyes off Silas. "Now, step aside." Foster walked down the 3 wooden steps of the porch, his heavy cavalry boots making a dull, hollow thud against the wood before sinking into the snow. He stopped 10 feet from Silas, standing directly between the Apache warrior and the armed townsfolk. Foster was 6 feet tall, but Silas stood 2 inches above him, broad-shouldered and lean. The 2 men, one representing the weary, battered authority of a frontier territory, the other carrying the ancient, unbroken sovereignty of the high mountains, stood face to face in the blinding winter sun. For 5 long, agonizing seconds, the silence in the town square was absolute. The only sound was the soft sigh of the wind blowing snow across the boardwalks. Foster looked into Silas's dark, unwavering eyes, searching the depths of the man before him. He saw no guilt, no deception, and no hatred. He saw only an exhaustion so profound that it made his own bones ache, and an urgency that burned behind the Apache's steady gaze like a fire in the night. Foster rested his thumb in his vest pocket and gave a short, imperceptible nod. "Talk," Foster said simply. Silas did not look at the crowd behind him. He did not look at Harlan Ramsey's shotgun. He looked straight into the pale blue eyes of the old lawman, and when he spoke, his voice was deep, clear, and steady, a voice that carried across the frozen street with the unvarnished weight of pure truth. "There is a woman and a newborn child 4 miles up the ridge," Silas said, his English precise and unembellished. "She is bleeding. Her fire will not last 2 days. He paused, letting the words settle into the frozen air of the town square, before adding the final, devastating detail. "Her name is Elena Vance. Her husband left her 11 days ago. She is alone on the mountain, and she needs help." The effect of those words on the crowd was instantaneous and profound. It was as if an invisible hand had swept across the street, stripping the anger and the bravado from every man who stood with a gun. A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the townsfolk. Behind the lace curtains of the boarding house, women's hands flew to their mouths in horror. On the porch of the mercantile, the freight loaders slowly lowered their axe handles, looking at one another with sudden, uneasy shame. Everyone in San Rafael knew Caleb Vance. They knew his handsome face, his boastful talk of silver veins in the Mogollon hills, and his frequent, late-night visits to the faro tables at the Silver Dollar Saloon. And more than a few people in town had noticed the red-haired singer Clara boarding the westbound stagecoach 11 days ago, accompanied by a fair-haired man with heavy saddlebags. They had whispered about it over their fences. They had gossiped about it in the general store. But not a single soul in San Rafael had bothered to ride up the mountain trail to check on the young, pregnant wife he had left behind in the snow. Sheriff Samuel Foster remained completely motionless. His craggy face did not change, but beneath his steel-gray beard, his jaw set with an iron tightness that made the veins in his neck stand out. He knew Elena Vance. He remembered her coming into town 6 months ago on the seat of a buckboard wagon, her hazel eyes bright with hope, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, carrying herself with that quiet, gentle dignity that belonged to the Ohio farming families. And he knew with absolute, sickening clarity that if this Apache warrior had not stopped in the storm, Elena and her child would have died in agony while the town of San Rafael sat by its warm stoves and argued about freight rates. Foster looked at Silas for another long, unblinking moment. He looked at the frost on the man's coat. He looked at the empty hands that had chosen to carry the truth instead of a rifle, and he felt something stir in his chest that felt uncomfortably like reverence. Foster did not turn around to look at Harlan Ramsey. He did not look at the crowd. He raised his voice, his tone cutting through the freezing morning air like a whip. "Martha," Foster barked toward the porch of the boarding house across the street. "Martha Higgins, get your medical kit and wrap every clean woolen blanket you have in oilcloth. We ride in 10 minutes. He turned his head toward the blacksmith, who was still standing by his anvil. "Jakob, hitch the big bay team to my heavy freight sleigh and pack the bed with straw." "Move, then." Sheriff Samuel Foster reached out his gloved right hand, took Silas firmly by the forearm in a gesture of unmistakable public alliance, and looked up into the warrior's face. "You'll ride with me, son," Foster said quietly, his voice thick with a gratitude he had no words to measure. "Show us the way." And there, in the center of the snowy street of San Rafael, beneath the cold morning sun of 1875, the first crack in the wall between two worlds began to split wide open. Before Harlan Ramsey could summon the breath to object, the heavy oak door of the boarding house flew open with a resounding bang that echoed across the frozen square. Out onto the wooden boardwalk strode Martha Higgins. She was 34 years old, a woman of formidable presence with broad, capable shoulders, sleeves rolled up to her elbows despite the sub-zero wind, and a gaze that could strip the bark off a green pine log. Widowed 5 years earlier when a flash flood took her husband in the canyon, Martha had delivered nearly every child born in the county for a decade. She had set broken bones, stitched up knife wounds after Saturday night saloon brawls, and looked into the face of death more times than any 3 men in San Rafael combined. In her left hand, she carried a heavy, battered leather midwife's kit. Tucked under her right arm was an enormous bundle of clean flannel sheeting, wrapped tightly in waxed oilcloth. Behind her, 3 other townswomen hurried out onto the porch, their arms laden with folded woolen quilts and cast-iron soapstones that had been heating on the kitchen stove all morning. Harlan Ramsey, desperate to reassert his crumbling authority, stepped into her path, waving his thick arms. "Now, hold on just a minute, Martha. You can't go charging up that mountain with an Apache scout. We don't have proof of a single word he's spoken. It could be an ambush. It could be a trap to pull the law out of town." Martha didn't even break her stride. She marched directly up to Ramsey until her face was 6 inches from his, her dark eyes flashing with a righteous, blistering fury that made the large merchant physically flinch. "You shut your cowardly mouth, Harlan Ramsey." Martha's voice rang across the town square like a brass church bell, cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "While you were sitting behind your warm counter counting your freight profits, nursing your prejudice and stroking that scattergun, this man walked 7 miles through waist-deep drifts to save a woman you all conveniently forgot existed. If Elena Vance is bleeding to death on that high ridge with a newborn baby, we ride now. And if you try to stand between me and that child, Harlan, so help me God, I'll take that shotgun of yours and beat you senseless with it right here in the snow." Ramsey's face turned an ugly, mottled purple, but he took 2 stumbling steps backward, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. Not a single man in the crowd stepped forward to support him. The moral compass of the frontier, so easily warped by loud men with guns, had just been righted by a woman with a medical bag. Within minutes, the street transformed from a place of lethal standoff into an engine of desperate mercy. Jacob the blacksmith backed Sheriff Foster's heavy freight sleigh into the center of the road, the 2 massive draft horses snorting clouds of steam into the bright morning air. The bed of the wooden sleigh was packed deep with fresh, golden oat straw, layered over with heavy horse blankets and insulated with steaming hot bricks wrapped in flannel. Sheriff Foster climbed up to the driver's bench, taking the leather reins in his gloved hands. Martha swung her sturdy frame up beside him, clutching her medical bag against her chest. Foster looked down at Silas, who was standing by the sleigh's runners, his tall frame still dusted with the frost of his 7-mile trek. The sheriff gestured toward the bay saddle horse Jacob had led out from the livery, fully bridled with a deep stock saddle. "Mount up, son," Foster said, his voice steady and resolute. "Lead the way." Silas swung his long leg over the saddle with the effortless grace of a born horseman. For the first time in 7 miles, he was no longer fighting the deep powder on foot. He turned the bay's head toward the northern ridges, urged the animal into a steady, ground-eating trot, and led the rescue party out of San Rafael, leaving a stunned, silent town watching from the boardwalks. The journey back up the mountain was a brutal test of frontier navigation. To an ordinary wagon driver, the road to Elena's homestead was completely gone, swallowed beneath 4 to 6 feet of treacherous, wind-packed drifts that could topple a sleigh or snap a horse's foreleg in a heartbeat. But Silas rode 20 yards ahead of the team, reading the winter landscape with the innate genius of an Apache scout. He did not follow the buried summer road, which dipped into dangerous, hidden ravines. Instead, he guided the sleigh along the wind-scoured granite benches and the sheltered lee of the high ridges, where the snow was shallow and firm. Whenever the sleigh threatened to bog down in a deep draw, Silas would dismount, using his powerful shoulders alongside Foster to heave the wooden runners free, while Martha held the reins. For 2 hours, they climbed into the thinning, freezing air of the Black Range. Neither Foster nor Martha spoke more than was necessary, but throughout the grueling ascent, their eyes constantly returned to the tall Apache man riding before them. They watched his unyielding stamina, the instinctive care with which he avoided loose shale, and the quiet, relentless urgency that drove his every movement. The prejudice of the valley, built on decades of fear and distance, began to dissolve into the thin mountain air with every mile they climbed. By 10 o'clock in the morning, they broke through the dense stand of snow-laden ponderosa pines and entered the familiar clearing. The homestead stood before them, bathed in the brilliant, crystalline glare of the high country sun. The 6-foot drift still sealed the front threshold, but above the cedar-shake roof, a steady, pale blue column of pinon smoke rose straight into the cloudless sky. Silas let out a breath he felt he had been holding since he stepped out the door at sunrise. His pyramid of oak and cedar had held. The hearth was still alive. Foster brought the heavy sleigh to a halt outside the gate, the bay horses blowing hard, their lathered coats steaming in the sub-zero chill. Silas was off his saddle before the runners had fully stopped. He seized a wooden shovel from the sleigh bed, attacking the massive snowdrift, blocking the door with furious, powerful strokes, clearing a path to the entrance in less than 2 minutes. Martha Higgins was right behind him, clutching her leather bag, with Sheriff Foster following close, his hand resting reassuringly on his belt. Silas lifted the heavy iron latch, threw his shoulder against the cedar planks, and shoved the door inward. Inside, the cabin was warm, smelling of cedar resin, melted snow, and the clean, unmistakable presence of a mother and child. The oak log in the fireplace was glowing with a deep, radiant orange core, casting a blanket of protective heat across the room. Propped against the stone hearth, wrapped in Caleb's buffalo robe and Silas's fleece-lined coat, sat Elena Vance. She was pale as winter marble, her dark hair hanging in damp, tangled lun over her shoulders, her face etched with a bone-deep exhaustion that made her look fragile as spun glass. Resting against the crook of her left arm was baby Clara, sleeping soundly beneath the fleece, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. And in Elena's right hand, resting across the wool blanket with the heavy hammer cocked back, was Silas's Springfield carbine. When the door crashed open, Elena's head snapped up. Her finger tightened instinctively on the trigger, her eyes wide with the desperate, cornered defiance of a lioness guarding her den. Sheriff Foster froze in the doorway, his hands immediately lifting in a gesture of peace. Martha stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Elena did not look at the sheriff's silver star. She did not look at Martha's familiar frontier bonnet. Her wide, fever-bright hazel eyes swept past both of them, locking with laser precision onto the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Silas standing just behind them in the bright doorway. In that single breathless second, the air inside the cabin seemed to stand still. The ferocious, terrifying tension that had kept Elena upright for 3 hours drained from her face in an instant. Her trembling fingers slowly eased off the trigger of the rifle, letting the heavy barrel slide down onto the wool blanket. Tears, hot, silent, and overwhelming, welled in her eyes and spilled down her pale cheeks, carving clean tracks through the sweat and soot on her skin. She didn't speak. She didn't have the breath to speak. She simply looked at Silas with an expression of such pure, unadulterated relief, such profound and boundless gratitude, that it hit every person in the room like a physical blow. It was the look of a woman who had stood on the very edge of the grave, had trusted an enemy whom the world told her to fear, and had watched him return from the lion's den to keep his word. Silas stepped past Foster and Martha, entering the circle of firelight. He did not say a word, but he looked down at Elena, his dark eyes softening with a tenderness that transformed his fierce, chiseled features into a portrait of quiet reverence. He gave her a single, slow nod, a silent message that said, "You are safe now. The storm is over." Elena let out a ragged, shuddering sob, her head dropping back against the womb stone of the chimney, her free hand reaching out blindly toward him. Silas stepped forward, catching her trembling fingers in his warm, calloused palm, his grip steady and unshakable. Martha Higgins shook herself from her stunned silence and dropped to her knees beside Elena on the rag rug. "Elena, darling," Martha whispered, her seasoned voice cracking with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "I'm here." Martha's here now. With practiced, gentle efficiency, Martha set her medical bag on the hearth and immediately pulled back the woolen blankets to assess the situation. As she worked, Martha's eyes widened in profound astonishment. She looked at the umbilical cord, tied with boiled linen twine in immaculate, tight double knots, severed cleanly without a trace of fraying or infection. She looked at the flannels packed carefully around Elena's hips, observing the slow, steady weeping of blood that had been managed with remarkable cleanliness. She looked at the kettle of sterilized water steaming on the hearth crane, the clean cloths laid out on the mantel, and finally, she looked at the way newborn Clara was swaddled, wrapped with breathtaking precision in the thick, fleece-lined wool of Silas's own coat, protected from every stray draft of mountain air. Martha slowly turned her head and looked up at Silas, who was standing quietly by the mantel, his hand still resting lightly on the stone. There were tears glistening in the corners of the seasoned midwife's eyes. "Foster," Martha whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the sheriff, who had taken off his hat and was staring at the scene in absolute awe. "I've delivered more than 80 babies in this territory over the last 12 years. And I swear before Almighty God, there isn't a trained doctor in Denver who could have done a cleaner, more honorable job than this man did in the dark." Foster looked from the sleeping child to Silas, his craggy face tight with emotion. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I believe you, Martha. I believe you." Martha immediately went to work. From her leather bag, she pulled a dark glass bottle of dried goldenrod and wild witch hazel tincture, mixing a potent, bitter dose into a tin cup of warm water and holding it to Elena's cracked lips. "Drink this, sweetheart," Martha coaxed gently, supporting the back of Elena's head. "It'll taste like bitter root, but it'll clamp down that bleeding within the hour and bring your strength back." Elena drank the medicine, wincing at the sharp taste, but feeling the soothing, restorative warmth begin to spread through her exhausted body almost immediately. Martha turned her attention to Clara, unwrapping the fleece bundle just enough to inspect the baby's breathing, skin tone, and limbs. The tiny girl wrinkled her nose, kicked her little legs against the wool, and let out a soft, indignant squeak that brought the first genuine, exhausted smile to Elena's face. "She's a perfect, beautiful little jewel, Elena," Martha declared softly, her rough fingers gently stroking the baby's dark curls. "Strong as an iron nail, just like her mother, and her protector," Elena whispered softly, her eyes drifting back to Silas. "We have to move them, Martha," Sheriff Foster said quietly from the door, looking at the low winter sun outside. "The temperature on this ridge is going to drop 20 below zero the minute the sun dips behind the Mogollon peaks. If we get caught up here after dark, the horses will freeze." "He's right," Martha agreed, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. "We need to get Elena into a real bed with feather mattresses, hot broth, and continuous heat." Martha and Foster quickly prepared the sleigh. They brought in fresh, heated soapstones wrapped in layers of flannel, arranging them in the center of the deep straw bed to create a heated nest that would radiate warmth for hours. They layered 4 heavy wool quilts over the straw, preparing a cocoon that would seal out the bitter mountain wind. When the sleigh was ready, Sheriff Foster stepped forward to lift Elena, but stopped, looking at her frail, trembling condition. He hesitated, realizing the immense pain any movement would cause her. Silas stepped forward quietly. He looked at Elena, his dark eyes asking for her permission before his hands ever reached out. Elena looked up at him and nodded, raising her arms slightly toward him without an ounce of hesitation. Silas knelt down on the rug. With infinite care, he slid his left arm beneath her shoulders, supporting her neck, and slid his powerful right arm beneath her knees. He lifted her from the floor with a smooth, effortless strength that barely disturbed the blankets wrapped around her. Elena let out a soft, involuntary gasp as her head fell naturally against his broad shoulder, her cheek resting against the warm buckskin of his chest. For a fraction of a second, her hand reached up, her fingers lightly brushing against the chiseled line of his jawline in a gesture of intimate, silent gratitude. Silas's chest rose with a deep, steady breath. He held her against his heart with a fierce, protective reverence, carrying her across the threshold of the cabin that had almost become her tomb. Martha followed immediately, carrying baby Clara wrapped securely against her bosom. Silas carried Elena out into the blinding sunlight, stepping down the snow-cleared path to the freight sleigh. He lowered her gently into the nest of straw and heated stones, arranging the quilts around her shoulders with the meticulous attention of a guardian. Martha climbed into the back beside her, settling Clara into Elena's waiting arms beneath the heavy buffalo robe, tucking the edges so that only the baby's tiny nose was exposed to the crisp mountain air. "Thank you, Silas," Elena whispered, her voice muffled by the thick woolen blankets, her hazel eyes shining with unspeakable emotion. Silas stood by the side of the sleigh, his tall silhouette outlined against the radiant blue sky. "Rest now, Elena," he said softly, in that deep, grounding baritone that had guided her through the darkest hours of the night. "The town is waiting, but they will not hurt you. I will ride behind the wagon." Foster climbed onto the driver's bench, took up the reins, and clicked to the team. The heavy bay horses leaned into their leather collars, their iron-shod hooves digging into the hard-packed snow, and the sleigh lurched forward with a soft, sliding hiss of steel runners over ice. The descent down the Mogollon range was bathed in the glorious, amber light of midday. Behind the sleigh rode Silas, tall and watchful on the bay horse, his dark hair catching the wind, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line and the valley below. He was returning to the town that had greeted him with loaded shotguns only 3 hours earlier, but the air around him had fundamentally shifted. When the sleigh pulled into the southern end of San Rafael just past noon, the scene on Main Street was entirely different from the hostile standoff of the morning. Word had spread through the settlement like wildfire. The shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the freight drivers, and the housewives had gathered along the wooden boardwalks. But there were no rifles poking out from the tavern windows now. There were no axe handles in the hands of the warehouse workers. As the sleigh glided down the center of the street, the townspeople stood in stunned, reverent silence. They saw the golden straw on the sleigh bed. They saw Elena Vance, pale and beautiful, holding her newborn daughter beneath the heavy quilts. And they saw Martha Higgins, sitting beside her, her face triumphant and fierce. And behind the sleigh, riding with quiet, unshakable dignity, was the Apache warrior who had made it all possible. Harlan Ramsey stood on the porch of his mercantile, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face dark with unresolved bitterness. But around him, the men of his own syndicate were taking off their hats as the sleigh passed, a silent, involuntary gesture of respect for a mother who had survived, and for a man whose honor had put their own cowardice to shame. Sheriff Foster pulled the team to a halt behind Martha's boarding house, away from the prying eyes of the street. The back door was already propped open, and the scent of rich chicken broth, lavender soap, and burning pine poured out into the crisp winter air. Within minutes, Foster and Silas had carried Elena up the back stairs into the sunny, private corner bedroom that Martha had prepared. They laid Elena into a massive 4-poster bed, fitted with thick feather mattresses and crisp, clean linen sheets. A roaring fire crackled in the room's private cast-iron stove, filling the space with luxurious, enveloping warmth. Beside the bed stood a polished oak cradle lined with soft flannel, waiting for its tiny occupant. Martha immediately began bustling around the room, serving bowls of steaming broth and settling baby Clara into the cradle, while Sheriff Foster stood in the doorway, his hat in his hand, a broad, relieved smile breaking across his weathered face. Silas remained standing just outside the threshold of the bedroom door, his tall frame lingering in the quiet shadows of the hallway. He looked at the clean bed, the porcelain wash basin, and the lace curtains fluttering in the draft from the stove. He knew this was the white man's world, a world of painted wood, soft linen, and town laws. He knew his presence inside this room was an anomaly that the territory would struggle to accept. He took a slow step backward into the hallway, preparing to turn and leave, to retreat to the cold sanctuary of the livery barn where he belonged in the eyes of the law. From the feather bed, Elena saw him move. "Silas?" she called out. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the warm room with a sharp, undeniable clarity that stopped him dead in his tracks. Silas turned back toward the open doorway. Elena was sitting propped up against the bank of white pillows, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her hazel eyes locked onto his with an intensity that ignored the sheriff, ignored Martha, and ignored every social boundary that divided the New Mexico territory. She did not say thank you. She did not speak of the storm or the birth. She simply looked at him across the threshold of the sunny room, her lips parting in a soft, breathless plea that held the weight of everything they had shared in the firelight. "Don't leave, Silas," Elena whispered, her hand resting against the edge of the quilt. "Please, stay where I can see you." Silas looked into her eyes, feeling the profound, unbreakable pull of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of the blizzard. He looked at Sheriff Foster, who gave him a quiet, approving nod from the corner of the room. Silas took off his heavy winter coat, hung it on the wooden peg beside the door, and stepped across the threshold into the light. In the days that followed the great rescue on the mountain, a strange and delicate peace settled over the town of San Rafael. The winter sun shone bright and cold over the New Mexico territory, casting long, blue shadows across the snow-choked streets. By rights, an Apache man who had entered a white frontier settlement under a flag of truce should have collected whatever meager thanks the townsfolk offered and vanished back into the high granite passes of the Black Range before the temporary goodwill of the community had time to sour. Every rational instinct of frontier survival dictated that Silas should ride south toward the Warm Springs Canyon, where his clan was wintering in safety. Yet, when Sheriff Samuel Foster quietly asked him on the second morning when he intended to take to the trail, Silas had looked the veteran lawman in the eye with that unyielding, obsidian gaze and spoken with quiet finality. "A hunter does not pull a fawn from a frozen creek and leave it on the bank before its legs can hold its weight. I will not leave San Rafael until Elena Vance is on her feet and her hearth is secure." Foster, who had spent 4 years watching men abandon their posts in the war, recognized an unbreakable code of honor when he saw it. He did not argue. Instead, the sheriff quietly opened the side door of his large, private livery barn behind the courthouse. It was a sturdy, 2-story timber structure, well chinked against the wind, smelling of sweet clover hay, polished leather, and the warm, reassuring presence of 3 grain-fed horses. In the corner of the hayloft, Foster laid down 3 clean woolen army blankets, a heavy buffalo hide, and a cedar crate to hold a kerosene lantern. Every morning before dawn, the sheriff would hang a fresh tin bucket of hot black chicory coffee on a wooden peg inside the barn door, along with a plate of fresh biscuits and salt pork from his own kitchen, asking no questions and demanding no explanations. Silas made the livery barn his sanctuary. He was careful. He did not walk the boardwalks during the busy hours of midday, when men like Harlan Ramsey gathered on the porch of the Mercantile to nurse their wounded pride and complain about the shifting times. Silas knew that the town's tolerance was a fragile, paper-thin thing, held together only by the fierce moral authority of Martha Higgins and the loaded revolver on Foster's hip. He had no desire to provoke a fight, but he had no intention of abandoning his watch. During the long, quiet afternoons in the sunlit dust of the barn, while the draft horses munched their oats, Silas worked with his hands. He cleaned his Springfield carbine with oiled flannel until the dark walnut stock gleamed. He mended the leather fringe on his moccasins. And, using a small, razor-sharp pocket knife and a cured branch of fragrant mountain willow he had brought down from the ridge, he spent hours carving, with astonishing, delicate precision. His large, calloused fingers smoothed the wood, rounding every edge until it was as soft as river silk, fashioning a tiny, interlocking teething rattle adorned with small pine-pitch beads that chimed with a soft, musical whisper when shaken. Whenever he worked, his dark eyes would drift to the small, 4-paned window of the hayloft. From that high perch, he had an unobstructed view of the rear courtyard of Martha's boarding house, 50 yards away, across a snow-covered apple orchard. And specifically, his gaze rested upon the second-story corner window, the room where the lace curtains were drawn, where the brick chimney puffed a steady, pale blue ribbon of wood smoke into the crisp winter sky, and where the woman who had captured his spirit was slowly reclaiming her life. Every evening, precisely as the sun began to dip behind the jagged crest of the Mogollon peaks, painting the snowfields in breathtaking washes of lavender, rose, and amber, Silas would climb down from the loft. He would wash his face and hands in the clean, cold water of the horse trough, brush the hay from his dark buckskin trousers, and throw his heavy fleece capote over his broad shoulders. He would cross the orchard in the gathering twilight, his moccasins making no more sound on the crust of the snow than a falling leaf. Martha Higgins had left the wooden latch on the back garden door unhooked. The formidable midwife, whose sharp tongue had cowed every roughneck in the county, would simply look up from her cast-iron skillet on the kitchen stove as the shadow fell across the threshold. She would give Silas a brief, knowing nod, a look of profound, womanly approval that transcended race and language, and gesture toward the back staircase with a wooden spoon. "She's awake, Silas. Took a whole bowl of beef broth and half a loaf of sourdough today. Go on up before the tea gets cold." Silas would climb the narrow pine stairs with slow, deliberate steps, removing his fur-lined capote at the landing. He would pause outside the heavy oak door of the corner bedroom, lift his hand, and tap twice with his knuckles a light, rhythmic cadence that Elena had learned to anticipate with an eagerness that made her heart race against her ribs. From inside would come her voice, soft, warm, and rich with welcome. "Come in, Silas." When he pushed the door open, the atmosphere of the room would wrap around him like a warm blanket. It was a world entirely foreign to an Apache warrior, yet one that felt more like home than any place he had known in years. The air was rich with the soothing scents of dried chamomile blossoms, lavender water, clean cotton, and the sweet, milky fragrance of a thriving newborn child. In the corner, the black cast-iron stove radiated an even, luxurious heat, its small isinglass window glowing with a cheerful orange flame that flickered across the floral wallpaper and the polished pine floorboards. And there, seated in the high-backed oak rocking chair beside the window, was Elena. In the 7 days since the rescue, the pale, deathly gray that had haunted her features on the mountain had vanished, replaced by a soft, blooming vitality. Her dark, wavy hair, freshly washed and brushed until it shone like polished walnut, was gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, with a blue velvet ribbon, with soft, stray tendrils framing the delicate curve of her jawline. She wore a modest, high-collared dressing gown of pale green flannel, draped over with a heavy cream-colored woolen shawl that Martha had knitted. Her hazel eyes, large and luminous in the lamplight, would instantly find his the moment he crossed the threshold, lighting up with a radiant, unguarded warmth that took his breath away. On this particular evening, as Silas stepped into the room, Elena was holding baby Clara against her breast. A modesty blanket of soft white flannel was draped carefully over her shoulder, shielding her exposed skin, but the intimate, sacred reality of the moment was unmistakable. Clara, now a week old, with a thick crown of dark hair and plump, rosy cheeks, was nursing with vigorous, rhythmic content, her tiny, star-shaped hand resting flat against the curve of her mother's chest. In the polite, stiff parlance of white Victorian society, a man walking into a room where a woman was nursing would have been expected to blush, apologize, and look at his boots. Silas did neither. He closed the door quietly behind him, his posture upright and reverent. In the traditions of the Eagle Apache, the nursing of an infant was not something to be hidden in shame. It was the highest, most sacred manifestation of life, the direct continuation of the breath of the Creator. He looked upon the mother and child with a quiet, holy tenderness that made Elena's soul feel seen and cherished in a way Caleb Vance had never once managed in 6 years of marriage. Elena looked up at him, a soft, self-conscious smile touching her lips, though she made no move to pull away. "You have snow on your shoulders?" she said softly, her voice carrying a melodic, teasing lilt that had begun to blossom in the safety of the boarding house. "Is the wind rising again?" Silas paused beside her chair. "A light dusting," he replied, his deep baritone rolling through the warm room like distant thunder on a summer evening. "The mountain is quiet tonight. It has spent its fury." Without thinking, Silas reached out his hand. His long, calloused fingers that had fired rifles, tracked elk through granite canyons, and built a fire to save her life, gently brushed away a few stray crystals of white frost that had settled on the fringe of the woolen shawl near her collarbone. It was the simplest of gestures, born of pure, protective instinct. Yet, as his warm knuckles lightly brushed the soft wool near the bare curve of her neck, an electric, breathless silence seized the space between them. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She felt the radiant heat of his skin through the fabric, a sudden, intoxicating warmth that rushed straight to her cheeks, turning them the color of wild desert rose. Silas froze, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second against her shoulder. He looked down into her wide hazel eyes, seeing his own dark reflection mirrored in the golden lamplight. He saw no fear in her gaze. He saw only a deep, trembling awareness, a mutual, undeniable recognition of the profound physical and spiritual attraction that had been quietly taking root between them since the night of the blizzard. Silas slowly, reluctantly lowered his hand, though his dark eyes never left hers. He pulled the low wooden stool from beside the hearth, setting it close to the rocking chair, and sat down. His tall frame folded with that effortless, predatory grace, his knees resting only inches from the hem of her flannel gown. "How is she tonight?" Silas asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur as he looked down at the infant. Elena looked down at Clara, her expression softening into pure maternal devotion. "She is an absolute terror," Elena laughed softly, a quiet, musical sound that filled the room with light. "Martha says she has the appetite of a lumberjack and the lungs of a town crier. She gained 4 ounces since Tuesday. She's strong, Silas. So very strong." "She is a daughter of the Mogollon," Silas said, a rare, faint smile curving the corners of his chiseled lips. "She was born in the middle of a war between the sky and the stone. She knows how to fight for her place." He reached into his pocket and produced the small willow rattle he had carved in the hayloft. He held it out in the palm of his hand. The pale wood gleamed softly in the lamplight, the small pine pitch beads inside, giving off a faint, resinous scent that instantly brought the clean, wild air of the high mountains into the room. Elena stared at the toy in his hand, her eyes widening in wonder. She reached out, her fingers closing around the smooth willow ring, her fingertips brushing against the broad, warm palm of his hand. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she examined the delicate, interlocking carvings and the satin-smooth finish of the wood. "You made this? In the barn?" "Willow is flexible," Silas explained softly, watching her face as she admired his work. "It does not break when the child bites upon it. It carries the medicine of the water. My grandfather taught me that a child who holds willow will grow with straight limbs and a peaceful heart." Elena touched the tiny, chiming beads, then looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You never stop giving to us, do you?" she murmured, her voice thick with an emotion that threatened to spill over. "First, our lives. Then, our safety. And now, this." She paused, shifting Clara gently against her shoulder as the baby finished nursing, pulling the flannel blanket over her sleeping daughter with practiced care. She burped the child softly against her collarbone, listening to Clara's soft, milk-drunk sigh, before laying her down into the polished oak cradle beside the rocking chair. Silas leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. As Elena leaned over the crib to pull the soft flannel quilt over Clara's shoulders, Silas reached down at the exact same moment to adjust the blanket at the baby's feet. Their hands collided in the small space of the cradle. Elena's pale, slender fingers brushed against the back of Silas's scarred, bronze hand. Neither of them pulled away. For 3 long, suspended heartbeats, their fingers remained entwined over the sleeping child, his broad, dark hand covering her delicate skin. The contrast between their worlds laid bare in the golden light. Silas slowly turned his hand upward, his long fingers curling gently around hers, his thumb lightly stroking the smooth skin of her wrist, feeling the frantic, fluttering pulse beneath her skin. Elena looked up from the cradle, her face inches from his. The silence between them was no longer the silence of 2 strangers in a storm. It was the charged, magnetic silence of a man and a woman, standing on the threshold of something vast, uncharted, and dangerous. The air grew thick with unvoiced devotion, with the wild, unspoken longing of 2 lonely souls who had found each other across an impossible chasm of history and blood. "Silas," Elena whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the wood stove, her eyes searching his dark, intense features. "I need to say something to you." and I need you to hear it." Silas did not move. He kept his fingers gently wrapped around hers, his gaze steady and deep as an ancient canyon. "I am listening, Elena." Elena drew in a deep, trembling breath, her fingers tightening around his hand. "When Caleb left that note on the salt jar," she began, her voice shaking slightly with the memory of the betrayal, "he didn't just take our money and our horse. He took my belief in everything good. He made me feel as though my life, my devotion, and my child were worthless things that could be discarded like dry leaves in the wind. I thought the world was an ugly, barren place where only the cruel survived." She leaned closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that burned with pure truth. "And then you walked through that door. You had every reason to let us die. Your people have been hunted, your land has been stolen, and our men have treated you like beasts of the field. Yet, you knelt in the dark. You held my hands when I was screaming. You delivered my daughter with hands as gentle as a mother's, and you walked into this town unarmed, ready to face a hangman's noose, just so we could have medicine." Tears broke past her lashes, glistening on her cheeks in the firelight, but her voice never wavered. "I thank you for our lives, Silas. But more than that, I thank you for saving my soul. You showed me what honor looks like. You showed me what a true man is. And as long as I have breath in my body, I will never let anyone speak of you as anything less than the bravest, most noble spirit in this territory." Silas listened, his chest tightening with an emotion so powerful, so raw, that it felt like an iron band snapping inside his heart. In his 28 years, no one in the white man's world had ever looked upon him with such absolute, unfiltered reverence. He had been called a savage, a scout, an enemy, and a renegade. But sitting in this small, fragrant room, looking into the tear-streaked face of this courageous woman, he was simply a man who was loved, respected, and seen in the fullness of his humanity. Silas slowly raised his free hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently, tenderly, brushing away a tear from Elena's cheekbone. His touch was so light, so reverent, that Elena let out a soft, shuddering sigh, leaning her cheek involuntarily into the warmth of his palm. "You speak of what I gave you, Elena," Silas said softly, his voice thick with a quiet, profound reverence. "But you do not see what you have given to me." He lowered his hand to rest against the edge of the cradle, his dark eyes looking back into the memories of his own past. "For 6 winters, since my sister died in the cold caves of the Mimbres, my heart has been like a stone at the bottom of a frozen river. I rode with my warriors. I hunted. I watched the soldiers build their fences across our sacred valleys. I told myself that the world of the white man carried only greed and blood, and that my only duty was to die with a rifle in my hand before they could put a collar around my neck." He looked back up at her, his expression softening into a look of breathtaking vulnerability. "When I heard you cry through the storm, the Creator shattered the ice around my spirit. When I held Clara in the dawn, and when you looked at me from that floor and spoke my name without fear, you gave me back my own breath. Elena, you showed me that even in the middle of a dying world, something pure and sacred can still be born. I am the one who is in your debt." Elena's lips parted, her heart pounding with such fierce intensity that she felt dizzy. The space between them seemed to dissolve entirely. For a moment, Silas's gaze dropped to her lips, and Elena leaned forward by an inch, her soul screaming for the touch of his mouth against hers. Then, with the disciplined restraint of a warrior who refused to take advantage of a woman in her recovery, Silas gently eased his hand back, sitting up straight, though the air between them remained charged with an intoxicating, electric heat. Elena cleared her throat softly, a faint, beautiful flush returning to her neck, though a radiant smile remained on her face. She leaned back into the cushions of the rocking chair, pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders, looking at him with an insatiable curiosity that wanted to know every corner of his life. "Tell me about the river, Silas," she murmured softly. "Tell me about where you grew up, before the soldiers came." Silas settled back onto the wooden stool, his posture relaxing, as he let his mind travel back across the years, back to the sun-drenched canyon country of his youth. "The Mimbres River," Silas began, his voice taking on the slow, melodic cadence of an Apache storyteller around a summer fire, "is not like the rivers of your eastern country. It does not flow through deep green mud and flat fields. It cuts through red sandstone canyons so deep that the sky above looks like a narrow ribbon of blue glass. He spoke of the seasons as his ancestors had known them for 1,000 years. He described the sweet, cool water of the geothermal springs at Ojo Caliente, where the earth steamed in the morning mist and the mineral mud could heal the deepest wounds. He told her of the autumn harvests in the high country, when the entire band would climb into the piñon forests, knocking the rich, oily nuts from the pine cones, roasting them in pit ovens until the mountains smelled like honey and toasted wood. He spoke of his grandfather, a medicine man who could read the flight of the yellow warbler to predict the coming of the summer rains, and he spoke of the sacred dances beneath the full moon, where the drums beat with the rhythm of the earth's own heartbeat. As he spoke, Elena watched him with wide, captivated eyes. She saw the poetry in his language, the profound, spiritual harmony with which his people viewed every rock, every tree, and every living creature. She realized that while Caleb Vance had looked upon these mountains with greed, seeing only silver to be gouged and timber to be stripped for quick cash, Silas and his people saw the land as a living mother to be loved, protected, and respected. "And your home, Elena?" Silas asked quietly, turning the conversation back toward her. "The land along the Ohio. Is it as green as you told Clara in the cabin?" Elena smiled softly, looking into the flames of the wood stove as memories of her childhood surfaced. "It is green in a way that would make your eyes ache, Silas," she said, her voice rich with nostalgia. "In the summer, the grass grows waist-high along the riverbanks, so thick and soft that you could sleep in it like a feather bed. My father had an apple orchard with 40 trees. In the spring, when the blossoms opened, the entire valley smelled like sweet perfume, and the petals would fall in the wind like warm, pink snow." She told him of her mother's leather-bound poetry books, of sitting on the front porch during summer thunderstorms, listening to the rain drumming on the tin roof, and of the naive, romantic dreams she had carried as a young girl, dreams of building a home filled with music, books, and an enduring, honest love. "I thought Caleb would give me that," Elena whispered, her voice dropping, though there was no anger left in it, only the quiet wisdom of experience. "I didn't understand then that a man cannot give you what he does not possess inside himself. He was looking for gold in the dirt, but he was hollow as an empty barrel." Silas looked at her, his jaw setting with quiet, unshakable certainty. "A man who does not cherish what is precious in his own hands is a fool, Elena. The mountain will strip away everything that is false. It leaves only what is real." "And what is real, Silas?" Elena asked softly, her hazel eyes locking onto his with a courage that demanded the truth. Silas rose slowly to his feet. He stood tall in the warm lamplight, his broad shoulders casting a protective shadow across the room. He stepped to the side of the rocking chair, looking down at her with a gaze so full of tender, unvoiced devotion that it made Elena's soul tremble. "This," Silas said quietly, his voice a low, sacred promise that vibrated in the warm air of the room. "You, Clara, the hearth that was built in the storm, that is what is real, Elena, and nothing in this valley can change that." He reached down, his fingertips lightly, gently brushing the soft wool of her shawl one last time near her collarbone. "Sleep now," he murmured. "I will be in the barn. If the wind turns cold, or if you have need of anything, you know where to find me." "I know," Elena whispered, her hand reaching up to touch the place where his fingers had rested against the wool. "Good night, Silas." Silas gave her a final, lingering nod, turned, and walked out into the quiet hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. Inside the room, Elena Vance leaned back into the cushions of the rocking chair, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of her daughter in the cradle and the distant, reassuring crunch of Silas's moccasins walking across the snowy orchard below. She placed her hand over her heart, feeling its steady, powerful beat. For the first time in 6 years, the loneliness that had lived in her bones was completely gone. In its place, burned a fire that no winter storm could ever extinguish, a fire born of the quiet, unshakable love of the Apache warrior, who watched over her in the dark. In the frontier settlements of the American West, truth had a way of being a short-lived commodity, easily drowned out by the louder, darker currents of human fear. For 3 days following the rescue on the mountain, the town of San Rafael had lived in the warm afterglow of a miracle. But gratitude is a heavy burden for small minds to carry, and by the end of the week, the poison that had been simmering beneath the surface began to seep into the open air. It started, as such things always did, in the dim, smoke-choked confines of the Longhorn Saloon. Every evening after the freight offices closed, Harlan Ramsey held court at the large round poker table near the back stove. Around him gathered the freight drivers, the warehouse hands, and the younger town toughs men whose pockets were thin, whose tempers were short, and whose pride had been deeply wounded by the sight of an Apache warrior walking through their streets with his head held high. Ramsey would lean his heavy elbows against the beer-stained oak, a glass of cheap rye whiskey in his thick hand, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial rumble that carried easily over the clinking of glasses. "You boys are looking at this all wrong," Ramsey would sneer, his small, piggish eyes darting from face to face. "You think that Redskin walked down from the high country out of the goodness of his heart, an Apache? You think they know what charity means? Use the heads God gave you. He didn't come to save a white woman, he came to scout San Rafael." A murmur of uneasy agreement would ripple through the table. Ramsey would lean in closer, feeding the flames of their suspicion. "He's sitting right now in Foster's livery barn, counting every horse we've got in the stalls. He's watching the payroll stages come in from Silver City. He's taking the measure of every man on this street. The winter snows will melt in April, boys, and when Victorio's band rides down from the warm springs to burn this valley to the ground, you'll remember who invited their chief scout to sleep in the town's own hayloft. We're harboring a viper in our bosom, and Foster's too blind to see it. Fear is a contagion that thrives in cold weather." Within 48 hours, Ramsey's manufactured venom had spread from the saloon to the dry goods store, to the blacksmith shop, and across kitchen tables throughout the settlement. Men who had taken off their hats when the rescue sleigh rolled into town now walked with their coat collars pulled high, their hands resting nervously near the grips of their revolvers whenever they passed the livery stable. The greetings on the boardwalks grew curt. The glances thrown toward the boarding house grew cold and suspicious. On the 8th evening, as the twilight shadows lengthened across the snow, Sheriff Samuel Foster walked into the quiet gloom of his own livery barn. The veteran lawman climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft, his heavy boots creaking on the pine rungs. In the corner by the cedar crate, Silas was sitting cross-legged on his buffalo robe, using an oily rag to polish the blued steel receiver of his Springfield carbine in the soft golden glow of the kerosene lantern. Silas did not jump. He did not reach for his weapon. He simply looked up, his dark, intelligent eyes reading the deep lines of worry etched into the old sheriff's weathered face. Foster took off his broad-brimmed Stetson, ran a hand through his gray hair, and let out a long, heavy sigh that smelled of cold wind and pipe tobacco. He sat down heavily on an overturned oats bucket, resting his forearms across his knees. "Harlan's got the town stirred up, Silas," Foster said bluntly, getting straight to the bone of the matter as old soldiers do. "He's been buying whiskey for every drift fence rider and saloon bum between here and the canyon. He's got half the county convinced you're charting targets for a spring raid." Silas did not pause the rhythmic stroke of his cloth along the rifle barrel. "Ramsey is a dog that barks behind a picket fence," Silas replied, in a calm, level tone. "He barks loudest when the gate is locked." "He may be a barking dog, son, but he's gathering a pack," Foster countered, his pale blue eyes narrowing with grim realism. "And a pack of frightened cowards with loaded Winchesters is the most dangerous thing in this territory. In '64, I saw good men turn into butchers because somebody whispered the word raid in the dark. If a mob gets liquored up enough on Ramsey's whiskey and marches on this barn, I'll stand on the threshold and do my duty. But there's only one of me, and there's 40 of them." Foster leaned forward, his voice softening with genuine regret. "Elena is recovering fast, Silas. Martha says the bleeding has stopped completely, and the girl's color is back. You've done what no man in this valley had the courage to do. But you need to take your horse and ride for the Black Range tonight. Before the hatred in this street catches fire." Silas set the carbine down across his lap. He looked across the loft, his gaze drifting to the small window that framed the warm, lit pane of Elena's bedroom across the orchard. "A wolf does not run from the ridge while the coyotes are circling the den," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the deep, unshakable resonance of mountain granite. Elena cannot yet carry the child 7 miles through the snow to the homestead. If I ride away into the dark, Ramsey will take his men to her cabin before the thaw and burn it to the ground to drive her out. I gave her my word on the hearthstone, Foster. An Apache warrior does not trade his honor for a safe trail. Foster looked at the young warrior sitting before him, so calm, so utterly devoid of fear, possessing a moral fortitude that made the civilization of San Rafael look shallow and corrupt. The sheriff swallowed hard, shook his head slowly, and stood up. "God help me, Silas," Foster murmured, strapping his gun belt tighter around his waist. "I was afraid you were going to say that. Just keep your rifle loaded and stay out of the street." But the storm that had been gathering in the shadows did not wait for the cover of night. It broke the very next morning, under the brilliant, unforgiving glare of the midday sun. It was a crisp, clear Saturday. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the weather was mild enough for Elena to leave the confines of the boarding house. Wrapped in a warm, dark wool coat that Martha had altered for her, with a thick knitted scarf covering her neck and a modest bonnet framing her radiant face, Elena stepped out onto the boardwalk for a short walk to regain her strength. Beside her walked Martha Higgins, proudly carrying little Clara, who was swaddled tightly in layers of white flannel and sheepskin. Elena walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her boots clicking softly against the frozen boards. The fresh mountain air felt like sweet wine in her lungs, and a faint, healthy rose had returned to her high cheekbones. As they approached the front of Ramsey's Mercantile, a crowd of nearly 20 people, shopkeepers, ranch hands, and several prominent town matrons had gathered on the wide wooden porch. At the center of the circle stood Harlan Ramsey, leaning against a flour barrel, holding forth with loud, arrogant authority. "I tell you, the girl was delirious with childbed fever." Ramsey was booming, gesturing grandly with his cigar. "She doesn't know what she saw. Taking a reservation renegade into a Christian boarding house, letting him lurk around our women and children like a tame dog. It's a disgrace to the county, and it's an insult to every white man who ever bled to tame this frontier." The crowd was listening, several men nodding in righteous, cowardly agreement. Martha Higgins stiffened, her jaw tightening as she prepared to unleash her formidable temper. But before the midwife could draw a breath, Elena's hand came down gently, firmly, upon her arm. "No, Martha," Elena said softly. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed a strange, vibrating intensity that made Martha stop in her tracks. "This belongs to me." Elena stepped past the midwife. She did not hurry. She walked directly up the center of the wooden steps of the mercantile porch, her chin held high, her hazel eyes blazing with an incandescent, terrifying clarity. The crowd saw her coming. The murmurs died instantly. Men shifted uncomfortably, parting like water to make a path as the young mother strode into the center of the circle. Harlan Ramsey froze, the cigar halfway to his mouth, his florid face caught in a sudden, awkward mask of surprise. Elena stopped 5 feet from him. She stood straight and tall in her simple wool coat, looking every inch the daughter of the Ohio frontier, proud, unyielding, and completely fearless. The silence that fell over the boardwalk was suffocating. "Go on, Mr. Ramsey," Elena said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the frozen morning air like a newly honed blade, carrying to every ear along the entire block of Main Street. "Do not stop on my account. Tell these good people again how delirious I was." Ramsey cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, attempting to summon his blustering condescension. "Now, Mrs. Vance, you're a young woman, and you've been through a terrible ordeal. We all understand that. But you don't understand the nature of the Indian like we do. You're being used. We are only trying to protect you and the decency of this town." "Protect me?" Elena took one slow, commanding step forward, closing the distance between them. Her eyes bored into Ramsey's with a fury so pure, so righteous, that the large merchant actually leaned back against the flour barrel to get away from her gaze. Where was your protection, Mr. Ramsey, on that Tuesday morning when my husband took our winter money, took our only horse, and left me alone in an unchinked cabin 8,000 feet up in the mountains?" Ramsey's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elena turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the men in the crowd, men who had drank with Caleb, men who had known he was leaving, men who had looked the other way. Where was the Christian decency of San Rafael when the blizzard struck the Mogollon rim? Elena demanded, her voice rising with magnificent, ringing power. Which one of you brave, civilized white men strapped on your snowshoes, hitched your team, and rode up that mountain to see if a pregnant neighbor had wood for her fire or flour in her bin? Not one of you. You sat by your iron stoves, you counted your freight profits, and you left me and my unborn child to freeze to death in the dark. Several ranch hands looked down at their boots, their faces burning with sudden, agonizing shame. Elena turned back to Ramsey, her finger pointing directly at the merchant's chest. And then the door opened, and the man who walked through it was not a white Christian with fine words and empty promises. It was an Apache warrior, a man your newspapers call a savage, a man you want to string up from a cottonwood tree. She drew in a sharp, trembling breath, tears of fierce pride glistening on her lashes, but her voice remained as steady as an iron rail. He did not ask for my name. He did not ask for gold. He saw a dying fire, and he built it with his own hands. When my labor tore me apart, he knelt in the blood and the ashes. He offered his strength when my own husband had abandoned me. He delivered my daughter with hands as gentle as a mother's, and when morning came, he left his only rifle behind to protect us and walked 7 miles through waist-deep drifts into this town unarmed, knowing you might murder him on sight, just so my baby could have medicine. Elena leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, searing whisper that reverberated across the silent porch. Silas Blackwood has shown more honor, more courage, and more true, God-fearing manhood in one frozen night than every man standing on this boardwalk has demonstrated in his entire miserable life. If that is what you call savagery, Mr. Ramsey, then I pray to Almighty God that my daughter grows up with the heart of an Apache, because your brand of civilization isn't worth the dirt on his moccasins. For 3 long, breathless seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence in the street was absolute. Harlan Ramsey stood pinned against the wall of his own store, his face drained of all color, completely stripped of his swagger, humiliated and exposed before the entire community. Elena did not wait for a reply. She had said what needed to be said, and she had said it with the unassailable authority of truth. She turned with majestic, quiet dignity, took Martha's arm, and walked down the boardwalk steps into the bright winter sunshine, leaving the town of San Rafael standing in the dust of their own silenced shame. The winter night that followed Elena's confrontation on the boardwalk was quiet, but it was the deceptive, suffocating quiet that always precedes a devastating storm. By midnight, the lamps in the homes of San Rafael had flickered out one by one, leaving the frontier settlement bathed in the pale, cold glow of a crescent moon. The sub-zero wind groaned through the eaves of the buildings, rattling the tin signs of the mercantile and sweeping thin, dry ribbons of snow across the frozen ruts of Main Street. In the small, cramped telegraph office attached to the stagecoach depot, the brass key began to chatter in the dark. Click, click, clack. Click, clack. The sound was sharp, erratic, and urgent. The sleepy night operator, huddled over a small cast-iron stove with a blanket over his shoulders, set down his tin cup of chicory and reached for his pencil and pad. As his hand translated the rapid sequence of electric pulses into English letters, the operator's eyebrows knit together in confusion. The dispatch had been relayed across 3 territorial lines, originating in the booming mining camp of Silver City, routed through the military station at Fort Bayard, and addressed directly to Caleb Vance, in care of Harlan Ramsey's freight syndicate. Less than 20 minutes later, the sudden, frantic thunder of galloping hooves shattered the frozen stillness of the street. A lone horseman, his mount lathered in sweat and heaving white clouds of steam into the sub-zero air, pulled up hard in the alleyway behind the Longhorn Saloon. The rider, a hard-faced drifter with ice frozen in his mustache and 2 Colt revolvers tied low against his grease-stained canvas duster, swung down from his saddle and slipped through the rear door of Ramsey's private office. In the deep, velvet shadows behind the livery barn, Silas was awake. An Apache warrior does not sleep with his ears closed. Raised in a world where a snapped twig could mean the difference between life and death, Silas had heard the frantic rhythm of the horse's approach half a mile out on the valley trail. He stepped quietly to the edge of the livery loft. moving like smoke down the wooden ladder and out into the shadowed corridor between the barn wall and the saloon's rear storeroom. He pressed his back against the rough pine planks, pulling his fur collar tight, blending into the darkness until he was completely invisible. Through the unchinked gap in the saloon's rear wall, the muffled voices of Harlan Ramsey and the rider from Silver City drifted into the freezing night air. "Is the paperwork in order?" Ramsey's voice came through, thick with greedy impatience and tobacco smoke. "Tighter than a drum," the rider replied with a low, raspy chuckle. "We caught up with Caleb Vance in a high-stakes faro game in Silver City. The fool was $300 in the hole and desperate to catch the morning stage for California. He signed over the mineral rights, the timber patent, and the entire homestead claim to the syndicate for $50 and a ticket west." Paper rustled on the wooden table inside. Ramsey let out a low, predatory whistle. "And the assay reports from the upper creek?" "It's real, Harlan," the rider answered, his voice dropping to a sinister, hushed whisper. "The assayers found a vein of high-grade horn silver running right through the granite ridge behind the cabin. There's a fortune sitting in that rock. But the claim is only valid if the land is occupied and filed before the spring court session in April. That woman and her brat have to be cleared off the mountain." "That won't be a problem," Ramsey sneered, the clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass sounding in the room. "The husband is gone, and the town won't lift a finger for her once the snow melts. Take 3 of your men from the mining camp. Ride up to the homestead before the pass is clear. If she refuses to sign the quitclaim and clear out, burn the cabin to the ground. If she perishes in the woods with the child, the territory will just write it off as winter exposure. Just make sure the land is empty when the surveyor arrives." Outside in the frozen alley, Silas stood frozen in the dark. Beneath his buckskin hunting shirt, the blood of the Cheyenne Apache turned to liquid fire. His knuckles tightened around the walnut stock of his Springfield carbine until the wood nearly groaned under the strain of his grip. He understood now. Caleb Vance had not merely abandoned his wife and child in a blizzard. He had sold their very survival for 50 pieces of silver and a ticket to California, handing their home over to a pack of wolves who were prepared to murder an innocent mother and newborn baby for the riches buried in the mountain rock. Silas slowly, silently backed away from the saloon wall, retreating through the snow-dusted orchard until he stood beneath the branches of the apple trees. He looked up. On the second floor of the boarding house, a soft, amber light still flickered behind the lace curtains of Elena's corner window. Through the glass, he could see the gentle, rhythmic shadow of the rocking chair moving back and forth as Elena sang a soft, silent lullaby to little Clara in the warmth of the room. Silas looked from that fragile circle of warmth to the dark, towering silhouette of the Mogollon Mountains rising against the starry winter sky. He knew that the sweet, tender peace they had tasted over the past week was an illusion. The white man's law would not protect Elena from the syndicate's greed. The town's shame would not shield her from hired guns in the dark. The battle for Elena's life, for Clara's future, and for the sacred mountain that held their hearth was not over. It was only just beginning. Silas closed his eyes, drew the cold mountain air deep into his chest, and whispered a vow into the starlit night, a vow that sealed his fate to hers forever. "They will not touch you, Elena. They will have to kill the mountain first." And that, my dear friends, brings us to the thrilling, breathtaking conclusion of Part 2 of the Embers of Mogollon. What a powerful chapter we have experienced together tonight. We saw Silas walk unarmed into the very jaws of danger, defying an armed mob with nothing more than the unvarnished truth. We saw the incredible courage of Martha Higgins, the profound reunion in the mountain cabin, and the tender, blossoming devotion that passed between Silas and Elena in the quiet warmth of the boarding house. And we witnessed Elena standing tall before the entire settlement, putting the cowardice of Harlan Ramsey to shame with the unyielding fire of her words. But now, the shadows are lengthening across the Black Range. With Caleb Vance's unforgivable betrayal and a ruthless syndicate of hired guns closing in on the silver vein beneath Elena's homestead, the stage is set for an epic, high-stakes struggle between greed and true love. In Part 3, the high mesa and the wildflower spring, the winter snows will finally begin to melt, and Elena will make the brave decision to return to her mountain cabin to reclaim her home and her independence. Silas will ride beside her to repair the homestead and amid the blooming wildflowers and rushing mountain streams, their romance will ignite into an undeniable, passionate bond. But when the Syndicate's mercenaries strike from the shadows, will love and Apache courage be enough to hold the ridge? You will not want to miss a single minute of the passion, the beauty, and the heart-pounding suspense that is coming your way in Part 3. Before we say goodnight, I want to hear from our wonderful community around the campfire. What are your thoughts on Caleb Vance's final betrayal? What kind of justice do you think a man like Caleb deserves for selling out his wife and newborn daughter for mining blood money? Where are you listening from today? Let us know your city, state, or country in the comment section below. We love seeing how far our storytelling family reaches across the world. If tonight's story touched your heart and kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment right now to hit that like button. Share this video with your loved ones, your friends, and anyone who cherishes the timeless values of honor, resilience, and true frontier love. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you are the very first to know when Part 3 is released. Until we meet again under the western stars, my friends, look out for those you love, stay strong through the winter winds, and always keep the fire burning in your own hearth. Good night, and God bless.